Hello, my name is Michael Lind. I'm the Whitehead Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and I'll be speaking today with Philip Bobbitt about his important new book, Terror and Consent, The Wars for the 21st Century. Philip Bobbitt is the Herbert Wexler Professor of Federal Jurisprudence and the Director of the Center for National Security at Columbia University. He's also Senior Fellow at the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. Hello, Philip.
Hi, Michael.
So the wars for the 21st century, you talk about the wars on terror rather than the war on terror. Why the plural?
I want to persuade the reader that there really isn't simply one war on terror, but three interlocking conflicts. One is a war against terrorists, 21st century global networked terrorists. Another is the struggle to prevent the dissemination of weapons of mass destruction for purposes of compellence, whether to states or to non-state actors. And a third is the effort to protect civilians from either man-made catastrophes like biological attacks, weapons attacks, or natural catastrophes such as earthquakes, climate change, or even attacks whose identity is difficult to determine, as, for example, some kinds of biological toxins and pathogens might be. And the reason it's important to see these as connected has to do with how we address the problem of terror. First of all, it shows us that we're not just fighting terrorists, that what destabilizes a society like ours is terror, not terrorists. Terrorists themselves don't have that kind of power and authority. And then second, I think it helps someone see that these three arenas are not entirely in sync, that pursuing one often means that things get worse in the other two. We've seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. I don't have a way out of this, but I want to make the reader aware of this sort of triage.
Well, so to go over the three wars, the war on terrorists, which is what we think of as the war on terror proper, at least as the Bush administration, others use that term. Your second kind of war on terror is what's traditionally known as non-proliferation.
Yes. And
the third is the duty to protect or humanitarian intervention. Is that an accurate
I think that is. I think that does capture most of it. It's very hard, I think, for most people to accept the idea that you should use defense forces, for example, to protect people against natural catastrophes. The duty to protect typically applies to other states, where a state is conducting campaigns of genocide or ethnic cleansing, or perhaps in some cases even refusing to protect its own people. That's when a state refuses food aid or refuses to allow the WHO to go in and treat people who are the victims of an epidemic. People can go that far with you, but it's harder for them to see the good work that, for example, the American Armed Forces did at the time of the Pakistani earthquakes or the tsunamis in the South Pacific. But all of these have a potential to create terror, and it is terror that we're really fighting.
Well, let's explore a bit the idea you talk about, which I've discussed in my book, The American Way of Strategy, and it's the basis for what Daniel Dudney calls Republican security theory. The idea that the international environment can become toxic for liberty at home within a democracy or a democratic republic. That's one of the basic ideas that you're wrestling with, right?
I think that's right, Michael. It is. The Declaration of Independence says the purpose of government is to protect our rights. That's the only purpose that it lists. And to protect our rights often can involve us in work overseas, in forging alliances, in writing international law. By the way, I think this is one of the important parts and the important themes in the American Way of Strategy.
Well, I do too, obviously. On this topic, something you and I have discussed before, there's a difference between the American perspective and the European perspective on sovereignty because of the notion that sovereignty is not only popular, based in a people, but also divisible. Now, you come up, as always, and I have to say as an aside, one of the pleasures of reading you as an author is your facility for coining new terms and new phrases, so that every Philip Bobbitt book, it's a new language that you have to learn, not only conceptually, but in terms of neologisms. And I'd like you to share with the Blogging Heads audience your definitions of different kinds of sovereignty, transparent and translucent and so on. I think it's very illuminating.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I will do that. Let me just first say that in setting up the question, you really go to the heart of an important distinction. Both Americans and Europeans would say that they live in conditions of popular sovereignty, that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were both about establishing popular sovereignty. And that's true, but it tends to sort of cover over, to paper over a fundamental difference. Europeans are inclined to believe that popular sovereignty has descended. That is, it was taken from a dynasty or a pre-existing state, and the people now have it. And having it, they can fully vest it in a state. And that's a very respectable view of democracy. Indeed, it's one that's held, I think, by most democracies. The Americans are the peculiar in this respect. The American view, sovereignty ascends from the people to the state. And that has important implications for international as well as for constitutional affairs. For one thing, it means that a state can qualify or even forfeit its sovereignty when it begins campaigns, for example, of genocide or systematic human rights abuses against its own people. For another, the Americans believe that sovereignty cannot be fully vested in the state, so there are always reserved rights in the people. Magna Carta is an example of a European view, where rights are granted to, in this case, aristocrats.
It's the concessionary theory.
Concessionary, that's a good neologism of your own. Whereas
it's not
our Bill of Rights, our Bill of Rights simply states rights that are already reserved to the people. And as you know, as well as anyone, Michael, both Madison and Hamilton were against the Bill of Rights because they felt it wasn't necessary to proclaim those rights. They were already in the people. Now, you ask about the translucent, transparent, and opaque distinctions. I would say that most states believe in what I would call opaque sovereignty. I use that phrase because it means that sovereignty, like a cloak, covers the actions of states. What happens within their borders is their business. Who they want to vote, what rights they intend to grant, what privileges they are willing to concede. So long as they're dealing within their own jurisdiction, opaque sovereignty holds that that's up to the state, and it's nobody else's business. China might be a good example, but as I say, this is a very widely shared view. Translucent sovereignty penetrates this veil a bit. It says there are some things a state can do to qualify its own sovereignty. Breaking treaties, for example, acting in defiance of Security Council resolutions. And the way that we know this sovereignty has been qualified is when a body, an authoritative, legitimate body, like the United Nations Security Council, says it has. This requires an official juridical finding. The American view, as contrasted to the translucent view you have at some cases of the British Foreign Office, for example, some elements in Europe, the American view I would call transparent sovereignty. Believing that sovereignty resides in the people and is delegated to them, to the state, Americans are inclined to think that there are certain acts a state may take that dissolves that delegation. Among these are slavery, genocide and ethnic cleansing, and the violation on a systematic basis of fundamental human rights. And if that's done, it doesn't require a unanimous vote of the permanent members of the UN Security Council for a state to say that the transgressing state has qualified by its own acts its own sovereignty. So that's transparent, and the U.S. has been a forceful advocate of this. Translucent's a little different, and opaque is the view of sovereignty that most states have long held, but that is under some attack.
If you don't mind, let's get back to the notion of transparent sovereignty and the idea that, which became popular after the end of the Cold War, that if a state violates various rights of its people, then it loses its sovereignty, can be stripped of sovereignty by other states, which can then step in to rescue the people, not only in the case of genocide, where you're actually annihilating a people, but in other cases of tyranny and despotism and of other varieties. Now, here it seems to me there is a major difference between a more recent view of this sort of humanitarian intervention or the duty to protect and the older Lockean American tradition. In the older tradition, shared by the founders and by proponents of self-determination by Woodrow Wilson and others, it was the case that a state was simply the trustee, to use Locke's term, of a people, and it could lose its trusteeship by violating the contract. That's what happened with the American Revolution, according to the Patriots. However, redress lay with the people. It did not lie with other states. Now, to make it even more complicated, another state could intervene only if the people themselves had begun a rebellion against a tyrannical government, and they had reached the stage of belligerency. So it wasn't simply a few dissidents or a riot here and there, but you had to have something like a proto-state having formed on the territory. Am I correct? That was traditional international
I think
law.
that is a classical view, but I think that view has been greatly modified in the post-war period. And the examples, I suppose, that come to mind are the Vietnamese incursion into Cambodia that toppled the Khmer Rouge.
Well, that wasn't a humanitarian incursion. That was creating an empire, a regional empire.
Well, I think it had more than one motive.
Having studied the Stalinists of North Vietnam, I don't think they were motivated by humanitarian concerns when they took over Laos and Cambodia. I disagree with you.
I'm afraid I have to defer to you on this, and this is an area and a subject you know better than I. So let me give a different example. The NATO intervention to stop the killing in Bosnia, I think would be a case of that. You wouldn't say, I believe, that there was a revolution going on. I think it was just something approaching a civil war and killing.
Well, one of the arguments that critics of humanitarian intervention have made is that it sets the bar too low for those groups that want to solicit external intervention. So let's say you're the militant wing of the Salvation Army, to use an old Mike Myers joke, in some breakaway province, that's part of a larger country, and you deliberately want to provoke your government to crush you and to massacre a few people, so you can then claim genocide and get the United Nations, or who knows, after South Ossetia, maybe Russia, to intervene to rescue you from genocide. Mm-hmm. Isn't that a danger of setting the bar below the classical international law standard of belligerency? You make it a tiny minority of people deliberately provoking reprisals.
I think it's a pretty fanciful threat. I take your point, Michael, that you are lowering the bar, that it requires a much more difficult judgment. I think you're right about that. And I also think that the reason why this is risky is because states may want to simply trump up reasons for intervention, as the Japanese did in Manchuria.
Or as the Russians may have done in South Ossetia.
And the Russians may also have provided a recent example of this. Mm-hmm. But I think it's unlikely that groups of people seeking intervention are going to conduct some sort of mass self-immolation. That seems unusual to me. We used to hear that kind of claim in the Bosnian struggle. The Bosnian Serbs would often say that the bombings in these markets in Sarajevo were really done by Bosnian Muslims to kill each other in hopes of provoking intervention. Whether or not this was the case, I don't think anyone argued that the Bosnian Muslims were firing round after round of howitzer shells into apartment houses in Sarajevo.
Good point taken. Just on while we're on this subject of transparent sovereignty or popular sovereignty, John Rawls annoyed a lot of international lawyers when he wrote a book called The Law of Peoples instead of The Law of States. What's your view of that? It seems to me the classical Lockean American view, and perhaps the view you're defending, holds that, well, indeed, the ultimate agents, the legitimate actors, are peoples, which may or may not correspond to particular territorial states in any given moment.
It's quite interesting, Michael, because you raised quite a provocative point. On the one hand, there is an idea that is at least as old as the founding of the American Republic, that peoples are the effective actors. You're quite right about that. On the other hand, international law has not taken that view.
Right.
In international law, the only effective actors were states. And so if I wanted to sue you or sue another state, I had to go through my state to do so. State-to-state relations provide the structure for international law. Now, that is changing. And just in my lifetime, we have seen this change with other actors, not just peoples and individuals, but NGOs and various non-state organizations become possessors of effective roles in international law. Now, you may say this means that the world is catching up with an American revolutionary idea.
I'm a bit more conservative. It's one thing to say the Abkhazians or the Ossetians as a people, even if they don't have statehood, or the Palestinians as a community should have some sort of international recognition, or indigenous peoples, the Navajo or the Sioux or other indigenous peoples. Where I draw the line personally is making the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, as much as I admire them, the equivalent of the Navajo or the Sioux as entities in world politics, although some people have proposed that.
We'll be remembering this when you apply for that next grant.
Right. Well, I work for a nonprofit, and maybe the New America Foundation can secede from the United States. That would be an interesting experiment. Well, I want to move on. This book is so rich that we can only touch on a few of the topics. But I want to explore this fascinating and novel vocabulary you've come up with and move on to the notion of states of consent versus states of terror. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yes. I think in our era we think of states of consent as democracies, and that's mainly the case. But I wanted to draw a line across many historical eras, even to eras that predate the emergence of the modern state in the time of the Renaissance, to say that from the very beginning of states, back to the classical city-states, there were states of consent. They weren't exactly democracies always, but they sought the consent of the kinship group, of the local tribe, of the city dweller, the people who were being governed, as opposed to states of terror, whose regimes could not be changed without violence, and who maintained their authority through violence. And I wanted to avoid the anachronism that a state of some centuries ago couldn't be a state of consent because it wasn't a 20th century democracy, or that today a state couldn't be a state of terror because it had some of the trappings of the industrial state. We don't like to think so, but the Tudor state, I think, was a state of terror. Certainly if you were a Catholic, you wouldn't have had trouble
hauled
with
up
that
before
proposition.
the Star Chamber.
Yeah, and we also probably don't like to think that the Florentine oligarchy was a state of consent. But I think the Florentine Republic was an example of a state of consent. So my first effort was to use that phrase, was to sort of avoid the presentism that sometimes attracts around the word democracy. And also to broaden it from simply representation to what people sometimes call democracy plus.
Well, you also avoid another word that I always found very awkward, which was constitutional state. Because any state can have a constitution. I mean,
in fact, every state has a constitution. Yeah. Britain has no written constitution. Right. Every state
has a de facto
has a constitution, of course. the state is constituted in a particular way.
So I think a state of consent is an improvement over a constitutional state.
Well, the state of terror I thought of as kind of a phrase with a double meaning. On the one hand, I wanted to convey the sort of state, Saddam Hussein's state, Stalin's state, Mao's state, that rules through methods of terror. On the other hand, I wanted to show that even a state as robust as ours could, if it reacted in panic or was not prepared for the challenges that we may have to face, could reduce itself to a psychological state of terror. And so in some ways I was trying to play on those words. And I think the idea that we are vulnerable to that kind of threat, and not to people seizing our territory or taking over the capital or something. If I'm right, Michael, is also an important element in the American way of strategy.
Well, that's exactly right. One of the themes in the American way of strategy is how do you avoid creating a garrison state out of panic? Or in the alternate form I talk about is the tributary state, where you appease another country, or it could be stateless terrorists out of intimidation. Yeah. So you're essentially talking about psychological warfare, and that's the link between weapons of mass destruction and even conventional threats by hostile states and terrorism. It's the psychological impact on the citizens of democracies or even non-democratic states of consent.
That's right. I don't think that Al-Qaeda is threatening the United States with the kind of war that would take over our resources or occupy our territory. I don't think they really want to take over Des Moines or Austin. But if they exploded a 10-kiloton weapon in New York and then said, oh, and by the way, we've got another couple of these, they certainly would be in the position to extort behavior from us that we otherwise would never have consented to.
Right, where they change our Constitution without amending it. They get to amend our Constitution by terrorizing us into giving up all of our liberties. Yeah, this was one of my pet peeves, by the way. After 9/11, Senator Richard Lugar, who I've always admired, a very thoughtful statesman, was quoted in a newspaper saying that these people can destroy our nation. Now, in a metaphorical sense, maybe that was true, in the sense that they can destroy our way of life. But isn't the danger that you're playing into the hands of terrorists, or for that matter, foreign governments, by exaggerating their power? See, what I wanted to see after 9/11 was for President Bush to make a speech. Well, this may be the Texan in me. You're a fellow Texan, so you'll appreciate it. And sort of the spirit of the blitz, right? And say, you can blow up one of our cities, you can blow up 3 of our cities, you can't stop us, we will come and get you, and we will not change our way of life. That's what I wanted to hear.
Well, I think there was some of that in President Bush's rhetoric after 9/11. It's a very difficult line to draw, Michael. On the one hand, you don't want to pretend that there isn't a threat out there.
Right.
You want to prepare your people for eventualities that we may not be able to prevent. And having prepared them, lessen their impact and mitigate their negative effects. On the other hand, you don't want to exaggerate or inflate the threat or build up these essentially criminal characters as if they are mighty warriors and great political leaders. So it's quite a matter of judgment, just how you do that.
Well, you've used the word in the last few minutes, preparation, repeatedly, and I'd like to turn to that because you argue in the book that we do need to think prospectively about a range of threats and to have legal regimes in place before they occur. And this is you've encountered resistance on this, haven't you? It's a controversial idea.
Yes, but one does encounter a good deal of resistance on this. But some of the measures seem so obvious. I'll just give you 2 examples. Take the example I mentioned of a 10-kiloton weapon. if it exploded in a parking lot between the Capitol and the Supreme Court, and it was a time when the court was in session, I'm afraid everyone in that building would be incinerated. Now, our current statutes provide that a process by which new judges are chosen. And this process is enshrined in a constitutional basis in the American Constitution. It takes time of nomination, it takes confirmation by the Senate before these judges can take their place as justices. If we lost all 9, it could be quite some time before we reconstituted that court. On the other hand, I believe that by statute, Congress could provide that the chief judges of the 13 circuit courts could themselves take up these positions as a sort of interim measure until 5 or 6 of the new court were confirmed by the Senate. That way you wouldn't have any broken lapse in legitimacy or in authoritative law. That's a relatively easy measure to take. The second example I'll give you is from 9/11 itself. If the fourth plane had hit its target, if it had hit the Capitol at the time it was projected to do, it would have hit the House during the roll call vote. If you dumped all that jet fuel into a closed chamber, you might have killed hundreds of people.
Right.
You might have killed far more, disabled or burnt far more than half of the members. But unlike the Senate, we can't replace persons in the House through a quick appointment procedure. We have to have elections. And that's something the House is understandably very proud of. It doesn't matter, really, if the numbers are so large, 435 members, and death and disability taking only a very few every year. But if you lost over half, there's a significant question whether you could even form a quorum. You'd have to wait for the process of primaries, runoffs, and elections. I would judge 6 months at the earliest.
Well, this was
in that interim period, you'd have a rump Congress that either couldn't act or would act with very doubtful legitimacy.
Well, a lot of these debates date back to the Cold War, right? With the idea of what sort of continuity of government would you have while the atomic bombs are raining down? You're not going to have primaries in generals a few months later, presumably.
That's right. I serve on the Commission on Continuity of Government, which, as you know, is a sort of a euphemism for what do you do if everybody gets killed?
Right. Well, I hope all the conspiracy theorists are listening. As you've discovered, bless America's heart. I love our Lockean libertarian country and its anti-tyrannical instincts, but they manifest themselves sometimes through these kind of counterproductive conspiracy theories. If you go on the web about continuity of government, you find it's a secret plot, right? Right.
This is the black helicopter.
Yeah, exactly.
Black helicopter crowd.
X-Files.
I was in Washington during a showing of, I think it was the X-Files. I think that the movie company had taken over the Uptown, that lovely old theater, I think it's on Connecticut, for a showing, and the place was filled with Washington people.
Were they all wearing sunglasses? Then it was the X-Files, because everyone wears sunglasses indoors, right?
Well, the audience was just, basics or a civil servant, and they're watching this thriller. And at one point, the key figure has unraveled the source of the conspiracy to destroy the country and take over the Constitution. And he turns to his colleague and says, "Have you ever heard of the Federal Emergency Management Agency?" Well, exactly. The crowd just erupted in laughter. The idea that this group could take over the country, and this was pre-Katrina.
Well, you're no stranger to controversy. I want to read a passage that you quote in your book, a letter from a friend, where your friend is writing to you, "If I understand correctly, 1, you are arguing against liberals that we truly do now have a war. 2, and you are arguing against John Yoo and the unitary executive people that it is war that must be subject to law. 3, and you are arguing against certain neoconservatives that we can only win this war through alliance. 4, and you are arguing against certain civil liberty types that this war must change our notions of civil liberties to allow for an effective war on terror." You conclude, "There is in my book, it seems, something to offend everyone."
Yes, as anyone is standing who hasn't been alienated, I will add another clause. Yes, I think that's part of the problem, Michael, that the debate has become pretty frozen, and it sort of replicates the political warfare on so many other issues. If you think that law enforcement should be the principal way of attacking these problems and that defense departments are really useless to attack terrorists, then you probably also think that we shouldn't have, amendments to FISA to do away with traditional warrants and provide them with special surveillance warrants. And you probably also think, and you see where I'm going, that these opinions come in sort of clots. If you are prepared to have a national ID card, well, then you may also be prepared to
round everybody up for the
interrogations.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is fine for debating societies, but as a key to understanding policy, it's absurd.
Well, you've had a unique perspective because you've spent a lot of time in Britain, where you've taught in Britain. You've been a fellow at Nuffield College. I'm interested, what are the similarities and the differences in the British debate since 9/11 and the U.S. debate?
You know, it's interesting. There are many of the same subjects being taken up. For example, the British are going through quite a debate now as to how long someone may be detained before charge. Right now, they can detain someone for 28 days. The Prime Minister has proposed 42 days. And this is quite a controversial move. That's different from the Americans. We really don't have a preventive detention statute of that kind, although the French do, and the Germans and many other countries do. On the other hand, the national ID controversy is just as active for them as it is for us. Although I must say, for my own part, I don't really quite understand the objection in either society. We are subject to so many other ways in commercial life of proving our identity that it seems to me very little to ask of people for the common good, for the protection of your neighbor, that you be willing to identify yourself to a valid authority.
Well, I think the horse was out of the barn when they gave us all Social Security numbers and fluoridated our water. That was the end of liberty right there.
Well, I tell my students I don't really understand the problem because when I was their age, I was trying to get an ID card.
Now, in your previous book, one of many outstanding books that you've written, The Shield of Achilles, which is a wonderful and often poetic survey of changing regimes in history, and particularly changing legal and political and diplomatic regimes. You argued that after every great geopolitical conflict, there's been some sort of settlement, some sort of new informal constitution of the international order, and you go back to the Peace of Westphalia and the Versailles settlement and so on. How would you integrate what you do it somewhat in the book, but I'm just curious, do you see a settlement like that emerging as a result of the wars, or do you think that there's just continued conflict and intellectual and legal and political chaos on the subject?
Well, what we'd want is a consensus that is arrived at without the devastation and the exhaustion of war. And there's no reason in principle why that couldn't happen. But if you look at the history of the state that I wrote about in The Shield of Achilles, it has been these devastating, decades-long epical wars like the 30 Years' War, for example, wars like the Napoleonic Wars, that by their horror and mass destruction finally brought the Society of States together to agree on a new international order. I don't know any reason, as I say, why we couldn't agree on a peaceful, stable constitution for the Society of States without that kind of devastation, but we haven't in the past.
Well, but even beyond that, a lot of your proposals presuppose that at least a lot of what you call the states of consent, if not the states of terror, will agree to some general standards for treating terrorists, some conception of the rights of combatants in wartime. So it does require, maybe Constitution is too strong, but at least consensus among the consent states.
No, I think, Michael, you are right in saying it is a kind of constitution. In the Shield of Achilles, I argued that for treaties like the Peace of Westphalia, the Peace of Augsburg, the treaties that came out of the Congress of Vienna, the Treaty of Versailles, that these were, in fact, constitutions for the whole society of states, just as we're used to talking about a constitution for a society of individuals in a single state. And you're also right, I think, in seeing that it's my hope that one good thing will come out of these wars on terror, and that is that states of consent will see how far-sighted and how careful they must be in protecting the rights that make them states of consent. That the threat of terror will actually concentrate their minds, that they won't panic, and that they will prepare themselves for what could be a long and increasingly fraught struggle.
Well, let's expand on that. You argue that globalization increases the danger of terrorism.
I do. I think that we're inclined to think that terrorism has been pretty much the same. We think about the Thuggee cult and the Sicarii that terrorized ancient cultures. And of course, there's always been terror and non-state violence against civilians. But if we look more closely at how terrorism has manifested itself in the era of the modern state, we see that it's changed quite a bit. People in Europe, or people in the UK, where as you say I've lived for quite some time, think they know terror. And they will say this about Americans. They'll say, the trouble with you guys is you simply have no experience with terrorism. We know terror. We know how to handle it. And you've reacted in a kind of panicky way because you're not accustomed to this threat. What they really mean is they know the IRA, or they know the PKK, or the FLN, or the PLO. They know 20th century nation-state terrorism. They never talk about the terrorists that sacked Rome, for example, in 1527. They were mercenary, they were intensely sectarian, as were the states that they attacked. A mercenary group of sectarians sacked Antwerp in 1576. They don't talk about pirates in the Caribbean who sacked Panama City and who were terrorists for the trade routes and for an entire region for almost a century. They don't talk about the use of Native American savages in the early American colonies as terrorists. They don't even talk about the anarchists of the 19th century.
Or the Ku Klux Klan.
Or the Ku Klux Klan. So what I try to show is that the terrorists of the 21st century will be a product of globalization. They will be global, networked. They will outsource their activities. They'll privatize their operations, because the kind of state we are becoming is global, networked. It outsources and privatizes so many of the state's operations.
Well, here I want to push back a little bit, because the argument on the other side is that terror is a tactic, that it is employed for particular means, as a means to an end. Even in the case of Osama bin Laden, the means to an end is restoring the caliphate. And presumably, if he restored the caliphate, it might be a state of terror internally, to use your ambivalent use of the phrase. But at that point, it would have its own nuclear weapons and so on. So it would now be a malevolent state. It would no longer be a stateless group. Lenin did not want to lead a bunch of stateless terrorists. He wanted to take over a government, which he successfully did. And then you can use government power. So not only do you have the situation that terrorists may actually want to take over a government and become a government and then shed their terrorism and just become a hostile regime, but also much of the terrorism, I won't say most now, given Al-Qaeda and jihadism, but much of the world's terrorism is old-fashioned 18th, 19th century wars of national liberation, where you have people seeking national independence. And they use terror in attacking the occupying country or the ethnic majority in the country in which they're a minority. So I take what you say about there being these novel forms of organization, but I have a twofold question. A, don't you want to exclude the traditional, Kurdish separatists from this, just conceptually? And the second, is terrorist actually the best word even for the jihadists? Because their goal is not terror for its own sake, but it's for a particular demented end.
Let me take up both of those questions. First, you're quite right. Most terrorism today is nation-state terrorism. And we live within nation-states, so this is perfectly understandable. And it's sometimes confusing when you see a market-state terrorist group like Al-Qaeda using nation-state terrorists for their operations. They will outsource operations in Somalia, Indonesia, Algeria, to local nation-state national liberation groups that they finance, they provide some planning for, they often provide weapons and explosives. So it smudges the picture, and it's hard for us to see the distinction. Most groups, as I say today, are nation-state terrorists, but not all. What will make Al-Qaeda important is that they were the first of this novel 21st century market-state group. But there's nothing about Islam or nothing about market-state terrorism that means they'll be the last, or that the jihadists will be the only ones that will provide the paradigm. And that sort of takes me to the second point, and that is the idea that terrorism is a means to an end. Of course you're right, Michael. Terror is a means to an end. You're quite right about that. The difference is that it is not only a means to an end, that a global market-state terrorist group may well have the ambition to create a global state of terror, a sense of terror that allows it to extort from other states political action of the kind that in the past only states could do. That's a new development. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, terror becomes not simply a means to an end, but also an end state itself. Right. The last point you raised, whether or not we should refer to all of these groups as terrorists, put them under the same sort of umbrella, I think I would respond to by saying my definition of terrorism, that it is the use of violence against people to keep them from doing what they have a lawful right to do, applies just as much to the terrorist who blows up a bus as to the terrorist who attacks the Pentagon with a domestic airliner. It covers nation-state terrorists. It ought to cover, if I've conceived it properly, it ought to cover the terrorists of many centuries. But having said that, I also want to distinguish between this novel kind of threat, because I think it will put novel stresses on us as a society.
Well, I agree with that. I may be in the minority in thinking that we may see a revival of secular ideological radicalism, which would use in militancy, which would use terrorism as a means at some point in the future. I think in a way we're lucky now, because yes, within the Muslim world, there's this crazy religious extremism that's convulsing Muslim countries and hurting us. But it has very little appeal outside of Muslim societies. And we're in this kind of lucky moment in history, I think, a very fortunate moment in the West, or at least in the industrial democracies, where there are no significant extremist political ideologies of the sort that inspired militants to use violence as recently as the 70s. Remember, we had left-wing terrorists.
Sure.
The Symbionese Liberation Army and the people.
I think that's right, Michael. I think these are our salad days.
Yeah.
Which is all the more reason why, in a period of tranquility, such as we're currently enjoying, we want to try to anticipate these threats. We don't want to have to act in the devastation that would follow one of these attacks. I sometimes say that we want to stockpile laws the way we stockpile vaccines. Put them on the shelf. We needn't use them until we need them. We want to debate them in an open way, through a democratic process of law. We don't want to have to go to some sort of official martial law and government by decree, because we weren't able to organize ourselves to anticipate these problems.
Okay, well, we've touched on one of the anticipatory legal regimes you've suggested that we debate. That's the continuity of government plans. Let's move to another. What about preventive detention? As you say, the other democracies have this in some form. What are the pros and cons of that? What's the case? And what would a reasonable regime look like?
You know,
what's the purpose to begin with? I mean, is this rounding up people that you are almost certain are members of some sort of violent group, and you just haven't had the time yet to find the evidence?
That may be one. I mean, I think that the dragnets that were conducted after 9/11 may have interrupted some operations, though they obviously swept a great many innocent people, or people at least who are guilty of only minor offenses in their wake. Often it's an effort to keep someone from alerting others that he's been detained, so you can gather more evidence. I think there are many purposes for detaining a terrorist that do not obtain for detain the ordinary burglar or petty thief. The crucial difference, I suppose, is preventive detention tries to prevent some future act from happening, whereas the typical arrest and detention is a matter of some offense that has already occurred, and that's different.
So I understand the difference, but being devil's advocate, couldn't you argue that's also the case with Al Capone and the mafia, and you know that they're going to whack somebody, and you don't have the evidence for it. But we don't have a preventive detention system for gangsters. What happens is you bring them in and charge them with tax evasion or some lesser offense. So I guess I understand why you would want different kinds of judicial systems in certain circumstances with different rules of evidence. But why the division between terrorists and gangsters rather than between organized criminals and terrorists on the one hand and people who, ordinary muggers on the other?
Well, you raise a very provocative point that the time may come when organized crime might pose the kind of threat to a society that...
So it's not the action itself, it's the severity of the threat. That might happen,
but thus far, we have made this deal. We have said, yes, we know that sometimes the perpetrator of domestic violence is going to raise the risk of a future hideous crime to a very high degree of probability. But he hasn't committed that crime yet. And so we either set him free or we give him some kind of control order. We don't imprison him. We don't detain him. We're prepared to accept the loss of life and the destruction that the criminal visits on us in a way we may not be prepared to accept from the terrorist.
Well, isn't this a cheap alternative and a somewhat miserly alternative, you want to think of it that way, to surveillance? In other words, suppose that you have the option of having plainclothesmen or even having them visible, having the FBI guys watching this individual night and day. My concern would be that because that's costly, costs a lot of money, and ultimately you do have budgetary concerns. That rather than tail this suspect week after week, month after month, year after year, that governments will say, well, it's cheaper just to haul him off the street and put him in a cell.
Yeah. Well, I think there are concerns on both sides of the knife. On the one hand, you're quite right.
The surveillance and alternatives.
Well, it can be a poor man's or a poor society's way of surveilling people. We're not a poor society, and so there's no reason why we can't use the most sophisticated technologies to allow people the maximum amount of freedom while they're being surveilled. On the other hand, you don't want to go the other way, and that is because it's not as intrusive as detention. we suddenly just sort of accept a world where we're under constant surveillance, or whether the authorities don't have to have some kind of showing before a magistrate or a judge before they can surveil us. So it really could cut either way. I myself am very much in favor of the sort of technologies that are coming online now that you see more in Britain than you do in America, where you can tag someone electronically if he's poses a threat to a particular group of persons. It's easier to keep them away from those groups if you use these technologies. But I also don't want to make it so easy that we say, oh, well, effectively we're going to put people into some kind of house arrest without a kind of conviction for a crime by jury.
Well, my own somewhat idiosyncratic maybe view is that the great fear, the great nightmare of American Republicans and Democrats and liberals has always been that you will have this large body of people with guns in your own society deputized to protect you, and they will have too much discretionary power and they will abuse it. Which is why if you can have passive defenses or even mechanical defenses, cameras in public places, as opposed to individual cops, if you don't trust human nature, then the camera is not going to extort money from somebody.
Yeah.
The cop might. And to many people this seems very sinister and Orwellian, but it's no different, to my mind, from the Dutch using the dikes so that they can avoid a standing army that would then turn on the population.
I don't find that a strange view at all, and it's also true in the areas of surveillance. If you have a machine collecting information, the machine is not going to extort any kind of unfair advantage over you. The machine is not going to invade your privacy or know your thoughts or have any reaction to your personal
until the computers take over and kill us all, but that's another movie at the Uptown Theater. Well, let's talk about data mining briefly. We need to wrap this up in a minute, but this whole civil libertarian that I am, a few years back I thought I would found an organization called the ACLU-TAPU. That's the American Civil Liberties Up to a Point Union. Right. So I'm a devout believer in civil liberties up to a point. And that point is reached when it comes to data mining, because I imagine if we had George Washington, who hanged people for espionage, and Benjamin Franklin, who ran a secret spy operation on behalf of the United States, and you told them that they could identify potential terrorist attacks by picking up words or phrases from all of these millions of conversations. I assume that's how they do it, through National Security Agency surveillance. They would have no problem with this. It would just seem reasonable with them. They would want some sort of legal system to do it.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. That famous quotation from Franklin was always Baudelarized to say those who sacrifice liberty for security and so on. But what Franklin really said was those who sacrifice essential liberty for a small gain, for a little gain in security, deserve neither. Now, I think Franklin would have been entranced by modern technologies.
Well, correct me if I'm mistaken. I remember years ago I came across a story that had George Washington presiding at the Constitutional Convention. Said nothing the whole time, except, if I'm not mistaken, on one occasion, where someone wanted to incorporate a provision in the Constitution saying that the U.S. standing army would never be above 30,000 men. And Washington finally intervened and asked whether the gentleman proposed that the governments of all other countries be limited to armies with 30,000 men. And, that was the end of that provision.
I have a friend at Texas, a wonderful professor of constitutional history and also a tax professor, and he asked me once if I knew why the Constitution had superseded the Articles of Confederation. I said, well, I thought so. What did he think? And he said, taxes. I said, well, you're exactly right. The Congress under the Articles had to rely on the states to raise money. In the last year, they raised only $624. And it was that propelled Washington out of Mount Vernon and led to the conventions of Annapolis and Philadelphia. But I said, what do you think those taxes were for? And they were for war.
Right.
They were to protect our people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that galvanized Washington.
Well, let's conclude by talking about the most difficult subject that's part of any conversation about this, which is torture and the use of coercive interrogation techniques short of torture, if there is such a thing. What is your criticism of how we have handled this since 9/11?
Well, let me first say that in handling it, we were dealing with a novel threat. We didn't know what we were facing. And if we erred too greatly on the side of violence, you have to have some empathy and pity for the people who were put in these awful positions. But having said that, a society like ours undermines not only our sense of self-respect, but also our strategic goals when we subject people to torture or violent, coercive interrogation. It is a grave mistake. It is, as the famous story of Talleyrand goes, it's worse than a crime. It's a mistake.
Well,
the ticking bomb scenario that seduces many of us can't be simply dismissed. You can't say it will never be the case when you have a terrorist, he has information, this information will save a great many lives, there's no other way of getting the information, and it's quite time sensitive, the bomb's about to go off. You can't say that will never happen. But what you have to do is to recognize just how rare it is, and you have to find a way to protect yourself from that very rare occurrence infecting the rest of your law. So the proposal I make in the book Terror and Consent is that we make torture illegal, full stop. And in the case of the ticking bomb, if someone really does think that, and on good grounds, on good reasonable grounds, does believe that he can save a great many lives by waterboarding someone, he'll do it.
Right.
He'll do it. You would waterboard me if you thought that that was the case. And then let the processes of law take their course. There's no American jury that would convict someone who saved the life of a city.
Is this a conclusion you started with, or did you reason your way to this conclusion after examining all the alternatives?
Well, I thought I arrived at that conclusion because I spent a lot of time struggling with it. But I discovered that back in the 50s, Charles Black had written an article in Harper's Magazine making a very similar proposal. Mm-hmm. He, as you know, is one of my great friends and great professional heroes in constitutional law. So we may even have discussed it, and I wasn't aware of it. I thought, Michael, knowing that you are yourself quite an accomplished poet, I would read you something from Terror and Consent that's by Marianne Moore. It's just an excerpt from comes at the end of a chapter. It's quite short. And if you have the patience for this, something from Zimborska on tortures. Let me begin with Zimborska, since we've been talking about torture. She says, "Nothing has changed. The body shudders as it shuddered before the founding of Rome and after. In the 20th century, before and after Christ, tortures are as they were. It's just the earth that's grown smaller. And whatever happens seems right on the other side of the wall." And that in itself is to me is a powerful argument why a state like ours can't torture people, even if we do it in some remote cell. The Marianne Moore thing, this might even be a time you might want to conclude, says, this is just a fragment of a beautiful poem called What Are Years? I suspect you know this poem. What is our innocence? What is our guilt? All are naked, none is safe. And whence is courage? The unanswered question, the resolute doubt, dumbly calling, deftly listening. that in misfortune, even death, encourages others, and in its defeat, stirs the soul to be strong. These are the essential questions that you and I have been talking about, although we can talk about the Peace of Westphalia and other very highfalutin subjects.
Well, Terror and Consent, the wars for the 21st century, is extremely rich. I think that the viewers, just from this very brief conversation, have just glimpsed some of the treasures they can find in it. I encourage everyone to read it. And thank you, Philip Bobbitt, for taking part in today's conversation.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you talking to me.
Thanks.